Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dara, and all the organising committee for bringing us to Beautiful Dead. I also need to thank Jessica here and Adam from the HSC for preparing this presentation for me and writing the reflection report. Mandy Mudas was actually meant to be giving this presentation, but she wasn't able to make it because she's actually working on a new project at the moment, so I've been asked to step in on her behalf to present this to you. So yes, this is the Social Transformation, Cultural Expressions, Cross-Cultural Connections and Dialogue Symposium that took place in Gurgaon in June this year. And there was certainly plenty of cross-cultural connections and dialoguing that went on there. This was organised by the Arts and Humanities Council, Research Council in the UK. And I think one key thing that came out from this is the importance of arts and humanities as disciplines in approaching this kind of research. And that looking at cultures and histories can actually help us to think about some of these bigger societal and global challenges that we're facing, and also the dialogues between arts and humanities subjects and social sciences in a broader sense, that together that these perspectives are all very, very important to bear in mind. And I'm from an arts background, so I'm going to keep expressing the word arts on a regular basis. So, we're going to begin by talking through our major themes that came out. So, multiple routes to modernity, this issue was raised earlier on as well. The groups highlighted that there is no one model of modernity, but rather multiple ways in which societies may break from a relatively static past and engage in reflexive processes of living. So therefore, research focusing on understanding the distinctions and differences in practices of modernisation in India and Europe was seen to be important, and something that came up across all of the subject areas. So some of the research questions that were put forward in regard to this theme include: what part is technology playing in the modernisation of contemporary India, and how does this relate to experiences in Europe? Obviously technology at the moment is a key feature, new technologies. Is it possible to imagine a link between democracy, development and modernisation outside the liberalist or neoliberalist perspective? What role has the creative economy had in shaping India's modern economy, and likewise in creating Europe's modern economy and the flow between India and Europe through creative economy? What role has colonialism, social movements, rights-based movements, political participation and secular democracy played in achieving modernity or not? And how have certain communities' histories been transferred into the present? So that was on multiple routes to modernity. The next question, next topic was governance, architecture, mechanisms and engagement. And interesting that this is something that's come up several times this morning already. So this was discussed in terms of the need to understand the architecture of governance and experiences of political engagement in both India and Europe, the organisation of decision-making and the balance between community level and national structures. And this was given to be important, for example, in relation to rural affairs and approaches to governance on matters such as environment and water. And one of the groups also highlighted that the approaches to governance adopted by the West are not necessarily the most appropriate for India, and vice versa, where alternative approaches might be more effective. So we need to think in terms of what are the differences needed in terms of governance and mechanisms in those cases. So our third topic is understanding alternative voices and perspectives of creative expressions. So for this, excuse me, I have my notes all over the place here. So for this, we were looking at recognising alternate voices and innovations. Conversations also considered the link between arts and performative traditions and experiences of marginality, exclusion and isolation. We looked at issues such as the role of creative expression in political activism and how comparisons between India and Europe relate to the development of cohesive, productive and sustainable communities or not. Our next one was everyday creativity and digital culture. And for this we were focusing on the cultures of mobile technology and the empowerment or disempowerment associated with this phenomenon, which may present questions on the notions of openness, opportunity and access. And this question of access and accessibility was really quite important throughout all of our themes. In regards to everyday creativity, comparison of Europe and India's public spaces was given as an example, as they were deemed to be creative areas providing space for performance, sculpture, art, etc., as well as activism, And that, as the previous was saying earlier, that they are also gendered and also operate in terms of class and caste as well, so that's why public spaces are particularly important. So some of the potential questions around this topic included what part is technology playing in the creative and cultural life of contemporary India and contemporary Europe, and how can we use technology creatively in designing projects with communities. So again, not on communities, but with communities. Okay, so our next question, our topic, was innovative approaches to heritage and communities. So we were looking at digitising resources, which was the overarching theme discussed across the groups, as it was deemed an innovative and important approach to preserving heritage. But again, we were looking at the problems of this and the politics of preservation, which has kind of been raised a little bit today. So if we're talking about that, then who is deciding what heritage it is that's preserved? Whose heritage is it? And does this actually create inequalities through other people's whose heritage isn't being deemed worthy or seen to be necessary or visible to be preserved, then being disempowered and losing their voice? So those politics of preservation are really important. So we highlighted the need to create new methods of digitalisation, particularly forms of digital technology that can be used to engage communities with heritage. And again, we were talking about the need to collaborate with local communities in order to create digital records of local communities' histories, which, for example, by working with local churches and temples. But we were also asking, with digital technology, again, this question of accessibility. So who has access to this if they're put into the public domain? And the implications for migration for economic growth in Europe and India. So throughout this topic, the group suggested that there's a need for measuring and understanding the effects and implications of migration on host countries and their countries of origin. So groups questioned how the economic effects of migration and diaspora could be measured in terms of their consequences, both economic and qualitative and cultural. So rather than just looking at this negatively, saying what have the benefits been? And that's looking both ways, so we can think of within each of the different country sites, but also the diaspora, so the flow between India and Europe. So we could look, for example, at NRIs in Europe and what kind of economic benefit they get within Europe, but also then sending money back home to India, and what does that do economically and culturally in India and other directions. And one that I've just been thinking about is the Punjabi community in Italy, and how the contribution that they've been making to the parmesan industry there. So kind of to think quite creatively about what have these movements of people's actually done in those new countries. Also we're looking at the idea of new cartographies of memories, cultures and heritage. So different ways of mapping and thinking about the kinds of mappings and movements that there have been historically. And we felt very strongly that looking at the history of these things was just as important in understanding present circumstances. So this was looking at the circulation of individuals from different cultures and backgrounds and how this leads to the circulation and flows of ideas, sounds, tastes, foods, music and religion, and the formation of new collective memories. And we were also then questioning what constitutes a notion of home for diasporic communities. And that many of these communities may be as likely to identify themselves with where they were born or where their families came from as to where they live now. So those questions of migration and diaspora moving across. So, just going to go through these sections quite briefly. So thinking about the future potential of these research topics. One key point we wanted to make is that these are research topics and strengths which projects already exist. So these are things which have already been looked at, which is why we feel that there's great potential in them. And also that the research should look at the potential of exciting forms of creative expression across cultures and the intersecting histories of print and digital cultures, for example, questions raised around architecture, heritage and conservation. And also to stress the importance of arts practices and practices research as part of this, so that practice itself, arts practices aren't used as something stuck at the end to have a nice little bit of community engagement, but actually form a core part of the research itself, both in terms of topic and methodology. And part of this is also the issue of intersectionality, which came for us across all the topics. So looking across issues of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, class, caste, and rural urban, which has already been raised today. So the potential of these topics in terms of research across social sciences and arts and humanities. So we felt that these issues are core to research in both social sciences and arts and humanities, and there's potential for meaningful dialogue across disciplines, and also to acknowledge the differences and how those differences can also help to create new research as well. Topics build on existing research collaborations, and they also respond to the need for the two-way conversation that we've been talking about between India and Europe. So rather than one on the other, that it really is about dialoguing and learning from each other, and that the topics engage with issues of global importance as well. And the key strengths. So research has benefited across social sciences and humanities by the fact that there are already excellent collaborative and interdisciplinary research which is being carried out by research institutes and university departments in India and Europe. So again, this is building on what's already there. There's a fair degree of student and faculty mobility. We've got one in my department in Exeter, where we have a split-site PhD programme with the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, which also goes across humanities and social sciences, and this has been creating new types of PhD research projects that couldn't have been possible without that collaboration. And the students emerging from this, the new early career researchers, already have that experience of being able to research in both different institutions in these different countries, which is producing really exciting new approaches. And I think a really key point is that there's great potential in dialogue between India and the EU, which will allow for reflections on histories and cultures of both, as well as sharing of methodologies, theories and philosophies that can generate new forms of knowledge. So it's really this dialogue where it's all sitting. Also then thinking about non-HEI partners as part of this, across the whole spectrum, whether that's arts organisations, different kinds, again thinking of maybe within India or within Europe, there are different kinds of non-HEI institutions that may be really important to bring in as partner organisations at this point. So yes, so just to finish, I know we weren't going to talk so much about challenges, but I just want to bring in a couple of quick points that I think a should be maybe thinking about. One is structural issues of visas. As we know, I think is something we need to think about. Ethics, as we mentioned, ethical appraisal and approval, and how that's very different within different institutions as well as across different countries. And again, some institutions have certain kinds of demands, and it's problematic if they're not met the other end. Language and methodological differences, so the fact that we, from different disciplines, may think very differently about the same term, and how do we approach when discussing what we mean by a particular term. The need to have early career researchers and postdocs brought into this as a way, again, of building growth. And finally, one thing that was stressed quite clearly is that a lot of people were saying that they really want some form of a database of researchers and institutions across India and Europe who are working in subjects that we can go to, and we wondered if EQUIP might operate as a platform for that for us. Thank you. Thank you.